Sun had barely risen over the quiet Korean village when it came. The knock on young Kyoungjong's door that would shatter the fragile calm of his youth forever. Under the relentless grip of the Japanese Empire, Korea's streets whispered of fear and uncertainty. It was the year 1938, a time when imperial ambitions stretched across Asia like wildfire. For young men like Yang, life was simple but harsh. Fields to till, a family to help, a country under silent oppression. But that morning, soldiers in crisp uniforms stormed his home. Their orders were clear: conscript every able-bodied man, the pipeline for an endless war machine. Join the Imperial Army, they said, voice cold and final, or suffer the consequences. No room for defiance, no chance for mercy. His mother's tears fell like rain as he packed a single bag. There would be no goodbyes, no farewells. Yang was thrown into a brutal system, stripped of identity and autonomy. The Japanese army treated Korean conscripts as nothing more than expendable cogs. They were pushed, beaten, trained to follow orders without question. Discipline was harsh, survival uncertain. The true hell began when Yang was shipped to Manchuria, the frozen battlefield where the empire clashed with the Soviet Union. The borderlands were unforgiving, their icy grasp reaching deep into the bones of every soldier. The Mongolian steppes stretched endlessly, a barren sea of snow and silence. The cold was more than weather. It was an enemy itself, as merciless as any rifle or artillery shell. Yang's first battle came quickly and violently. The Battle of Kyoungjong erupted in 1939, sprawling across the desert plains and rocky hills. The Japanese 23rd Division, including Yang's unit, advanced against a well-prepared Soviet force led by General Zhukov. Explosions ripped through the air, earth shaking under thousands of tanks and artillery rounds. Smoke curled into an eerie sky. Bullets tore at men's flesh, screams echoed in the chaos. Yang watched friends fall, fathers, brothers, comrades, never to rise again. He fought not out of loyalty, but out of instinct, to survive one more moment, one more breath. Amid the blood and fury, the inevitable happened. Yang was captured. Taken prisoner by the Red Army, Yang faced a world turned upside down. One moment, an enemy soldier; the next, a prisoner marked for forced labor, suspicion, and brutality. As the cold Siberian winds bit through ragged clothes, Yang understood that his ordeal was far from over. Captivity was only another chapter in a nightmare that would push him beyond human limits. Yet, in his heart, a flicker of hope survived, the hope that someday, this endless war might finally end, and a boy torn from home could reclaim a life stolen by forces far beyond his control. The moment the cold Siberian wind first bit at young Kyoungjong's exposed skin, he realized that his battle was far from over. Captured by the Soviet Red Army during the brutal clashes at Kyoungjong, Yang was thrust from the fire of battle into a nightmare of ice and endless gray. The landscape was a frozen wasteland stretching into infinity, endless miles of white snow and jagged icy forests. The bitter cold gnawed at everything, the rags they called uniforms, the cracked hands of prisoners, and the fragile breath that sometimes crystallized before it left their lips. Yang's new prison was one of the many massive Soviet gulags, forced labor camps set deep in Siberia's remotest regions. It was a place of broken bones, shattered spirits, and near-constant hunger. Men, many no older than Yang himself, died daily from exposure, exhaustion, malnutrition, and the merciless whims of the guards. Conditions were brutal. Mornings began before dawn with icy roll calls that lasted for hours. Guards barked orders through frozen breath, their faces buried beneath wolf fur hats, their eyes cold and unyielding. Each day, prisoners were pushed to perform backbreaking labor, felling trees with dull axes, hauling heavy loads of timber and stone through snow that reached their waists, digging trenches meant to defend a Soviet war machine that barely acknowledged their existence. Food was meager. A thin, watery soup, sometimes a handful of black bread, was all that sustained Yang's fading strength. But surrender was impossible in this place. The penalty for weakness was death or worse. Amid this unbearable suffering, Yang found moments to reflect on everything lost. Memories of his family's modest home, the smell of rice fields in the spring, the sound of his mother's voice calling him home before nightfall. They became both a balm and a torment. He wasn't the same boy who'd been dragged from his village months earlier. Here, stripped bare of freedom, he faced the daily choice between submission and survival. Around him, he saw many broken men, veterans from all over the Soviet Empire, forced into captivity by war, crushed beneath senseless orders. Yet some survived by forming fragile alliances, small acts of kindness, shared warmth in a snowdrift, whispered words of encouragement. Small gestures meant everything. Yang began to observe the camp's rhythms, the shift changes, the guard routes, the supply runs. He noted which soldiers were harsh and which showed fleeting mercy. In this frozen hell, knowledge was power. At night, as the camp lay shrouded in darkness and silence, he dreamed of escape. Not just freedom from the camp's chains, but freedom from the relentless cycle of war itself. The Soviets were preparing for a massive counteroffensive against Nazi Germany. Prisoners were seen as expendable assets, men to be thrown back into the conflict regardless of loyalty or origin. Yang knew his fate could soon take another turn, one that might force him into battle again, but this time under a flag he neither chose nor understood. Amid the endless snow and silence of Siberia, a fire burned quietly in a Korean boy's heart. A fire of resilience, of hope, of an unyielding will to survive, no matter the cost. After months, maybe even years, in the frozen wasteland of the Siberian labor camps, young Kyoungjong's fate took a sudden and unexpected twist. In 1941, the Soviet Union was thrust into a desperate fight against the invading Nazi Wehrmacht. The staggering losses on the Eastern Front forced Soviet commanders to utilize every available resource, including prisoners of war. Yang was soon marched from the camp to a military assembly point, surrounded by former enemies now pressed back into service beneath a flag foreign to their hearts. They weren't offered much choice: join the Red Army or face dire consequences, likely death. For Yang, exhausted and starving, the thought of fighting again was terrifying, yet survival instincts drove him forward. He was needed somewhere, anywhere, beyond the icy pit of captivity. The transformation from prisoner to soldier was harsh and immediate. Months of brutal training awaited him, where survival was traded for obedience, and every man was reshaped into a weapon of war. The once reluctant soldier learned to handle the revered Mosin Nagant rifle, marched under red banners, and swapped his prison rags for a clumsy Soviet uniform. His identity blurred further. He became a soldier of the USSR, though his heart remained tangled in the chaos of the war. Yang's new battalion was rushed to the front lines, thrown into some of the most ferocious confrontations along the vast Eastern Front. Blitzkrieg tactics, endless artillery barrages, and brutal urban street fights became his new reality. Every day was a battle for survival against bullets, frostbite, exhaustion, and the weight of inner turmoil. Yang fought beside men who did not know his true origin: a Korean conscript in a Soviet uniform, a man forced by circumstance to fight for 3 separate armies. The harsh conditions and relentless combat forged a hardened warrior from the frightened young man who had first been drafted years earlier. Yang survived tank assaults, sniper duels, and artillery barrages, but each victory came at a cost: companions lost, homes destroyed, and an unending war that seemed to stretch to eternity. His story, hidden in the folds of history, symbolizes one man's endurance through impossible odds, a forced journey through loyalty and betrayal in a turbulent world. The bitter winds that carried Yang's breath in frozen clouds marked the beginning of yet another brutal chapter. In 1943, during the fierce battles around Kharkov, amidst the chaos and carnage of the Eastern Front, fate once again turned against him. Yang's Soviet unit was caught in a devastating encirclement by a fast-moving German pincer attack. The pounding of artillery shook the earth, and shells exploded all around, turning the battlefield into a muddy hellscape soaked with blood. The fighting was savage. Yang fought with everything he had, every trigger pull, every maneuver a desperate act of survival. But the Wehrmacht's assault was relentless and overwhelming, forcing countless Soviet soldiers to surrender or perish. Yang was captured once more, this time by German troops. Stripped of his Soviet uniform, he now faced the cold, hard reality of becoming a prisoner of war for the second time. The German soldiers, puzzled by his appearance and unfamiliar language, probed for answers. A Korean man in the Soviet ranks, a soldier who had survived the Japanese occupation, Soviet captivity, and now held captive by their fiercest enemy. Yang's existence was an anomaly, a human embodiment of the strange twists of war that crushed individuality beneath the boots of empires. The Germans, suffering huge losses on the Eastern Front, were creating Ostbataillon, battalions made from Soviet prisoners forced to fight for the Reich. Yang was soon forced into one of these units. Clad in a new uniform, bearing marks he neither earned nor wished to wear, he was sent west to guard the Atlantic Wall in France, far from home and all he had ever known. The conditions remained harsh, but different from Siberia. The Atlantic winds bit cold, the forests thick and shadowed. Yang's days were filled with endless drills, sentry duty, and preparation for the looming Allied invasion. Amid the monotony and tension, Yang's mind wrestled with the absurdity of his situation. Once a victim of forced service under the Japanese Empire, now a pawn in the German war machine, fighting a war that dwarfed his own desires and identity. Alliances shifted as quickly as the battle lines. In the eyes of the soldiers around him, Yang was just a tool, a disposable resource, caught in the relentless gears of history. Yet beneath the cold exterior, Yang's soul remained unbroken. No matter the uniform, the flag, the language, he was still a victim, a man stripped of choice, forced into roles he never desired. He survived, waiting for a chance, any chance, for freedom. The cool, damp air of the French coast was a far cry from the frozen Siberian wastes and the scorched fields of the Eastern Front. Yang Kyoungjong, now wearing a German uniform that pinched and chafed his weary body, found himself stationed along the legendary Atlantic Wall, a massive network of bunkers, cannons, and obstacles stretching thousands of miles to keep the Allies out of occupied Western Europe. The cliffs near Normandy were rugged, windswept, and silent except for the crash of waves far below. Yang spent his days on monotonous patrols, guarding the concrete fortifications, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the impending invasion he knew would come. His unit was a strange assembly of forced conscripts, former Soviet prisoners like himself, men from across Eastern Europe trapped in the same cruel cycle of captivity and forced allegiance. The Germans treated them with suspicion and harshness, always ready with a rifle butt or cold glance to keep them in line. Trust was a rare commodity. Despite the relative calm, the tension was palpable. Rumors of an Allied invasion had reached even the isolated coastal defenses. Every soldier knew that when the storm came, it would be unlike anything the world had seen. In the evenings, Yang sat alone in the dimly lit bunkers, thoughts twisting like the fog rolling in from the sea. He was a man without a country now, a ghost among enemies, forced to wear a uniform stitched with the threads of hate. Memories of his home in Korea haunted him, memories of the distant battlefields where he had fought for empires that never cared for him. The faces of fallen comrades, the furious roar of artillery, the frozen nights in Siberian camps, they all merged into a restless storm inside his mind. Yet, it was the waiting that gnawed at him most. Days stretched into weeks, and the nothingness of anticipation was crueler than the heat of battle. The quiet before the thunder made every creak of the bunkers, every shadow in the dark, a potential harbinger of death. The men tried to keep up morale through stories, rough jokes, and shared cigarettes. But beneath the surface, fear simmered. They all knew their fate was tied to the will of forces far beyond their control. Yang's thoughts often wandered to the soldiers he once faced as enemies, American, British, Canadian, imagining them crossing the sea to this very shore. Would they see a young Korean man caught in the tide of war, forced to fight under a hated flag? Would they spare him, or would he be just another enemy to eliminate? His survival instincts sharpened. Every day he mapped the defenses, noted the weak points, and calculated his chances. Escape, surrender, survival. These were the only choices in the chaos. Then, the long-awaited day arrived, June 6, 1944. The dawn broke over the Normandy coast, the sky bruised with smoke and fire. For young Kyoungjong, the day he had anticipated and feared had arrived. The Allied forces launched Operation Overlord with a ferocity and scale that would shake the very foundations of the Nazi regime. The thundering roar of aircraft and naval bombardments shattered the morning calm. Thousands of soldiers stormed the beaches under relentless German fire. Machine guns, artillery, and mortars barred their path, spitting death and destruction. Yang stood in his bunker, heart pounding, as the world exploded around him. The cold, relentless sound of shells ripping into concrete and men screaming filled the air. His training kicked in, but beneath that was a deep numbness, an exhaustion not just of body but of spirit. The chaotic combat on the beaches was hell itself. The relentless tide of Allied troops surged forward despite being cut down by gunfire. Yang could see the pain and valor etched into every face, both friend and foe. As his unit scrambled to repel the invasion onslaught, the German command struggled to organize an effective response. The unexpected ferocity of the attack tore through their defenses like a blade. During the fury of battle, Yang's thoughts whirled. He recognized the faces of soldiers, not as enemies, but as fellow men cast into the same crucible. Confusion, desperation, and fleeting moments of humanity threaded through the chaos. Yang engaged in brutal close-quarters combat. His rifle crackled, grenades exploded nearby. Time blurred, each second a battle for life or death. Amid the smoke and blood, Yang wondered if this would finally be his end or the moment of his liberation. In the chaos, he seized an opportunity, an opening in the defenses. Yang made a split-second decision, dropping his weapon and surrendering to the advancing American soldiers. The shock was palpable. Here was a Korean man in a German uniform, hands raised, eyes weary but alive. The Americans hesitated, uncertain of who he was. Was he a spy, a soldier, or merely a victim of the war's cruelty? Yang's fractured story began to unfold through translators and questioning. His tale of fighting for 3 armies, captivity, and survival was met with disbelief and awe. The moment of capture marked a new beginning. Yang was no longer a pawn of war, but a man seeking a place in a world shattered by conflict. As the beaches of Normandy erupted into a decisive Allied victory, Yang's personal journey through betrayal, forced allegiance, and survival reached a crucial turning point. The war was far from over, but for Yang, the nightmare of fighting under enemy flags had finally ended. After surrendering to the American forces on the beaches of Normandy, young Kyoungjong found himself thrust into yet another uncertain and foreign world, an Allied prisoner of war camp in England. The war that had defined his entire young life was shifting, and so too was his fragile hope for survival. The American soldiers who had taken him captive were wary at first. They had never seen a prisoner like him, a Korean man wearing a German uniform, speaking multiple languages, and carrying a past tangled in the political chaos of empires at war. Disbelief mixed with curiosity as translators tried to piece together his incredible story. Yang was placed in a POW camp on British soil, a place offering better conditions than the brutal camps he had known before, but still a prison nonetheless. Here, he was neither enemy nor friend, just a man caught in the tides of history. He endured endless interrogations, not as a victor, but as a survivor. His fractured tale unfolded, forcibly conscripted by the Japanese, captured by the Soviets, forced to fight for the Red Army, captured again by the Germans, and finally surrendering to the Allies. Few could believe such a journey was possible. While the war around him raged on, the camp became a quiet battleground of survival and identity. Yang struggled with who he was now, soldier, prisoner, or merely a man broken by circumstance. His mind often returned to thoughts of home, Korea, still occupied and distant beyond hope. The uncertainty of his future loomed heavy. Would he be sent home? Would he find peace? The camp's daily routine was a mix of discipline and boredom. Roll calls, meals, attempts at camaraderie among men shattered by war. Yet amid the despair, small acts of kindness blossomed, a warm meal shared, a comforting word, a letter from a far-off land. As years passed, the war finally ended in 1945. Freedom was no longer a distant dream, but the scars of war remained etched deep. Young Kyoungjong moved to the United States, settling in Illinois, where he sought to rebuild a life stripped of nations, but not of hope. His story, as incredible as it is true, remains a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the tragic ironies of war. A Korean forced to fight under 3 enemy flags, surviving the gunfire had long ceased. The battlegrounds that once echoed with thunderous explosions and cries of agony were now quiet. Yet for Yang Kyoungjong, the hardest battle was only just beginning, the battle inside his own mind. After the war's end, Yang settled in Illinois, USA, seeking peace in a country far from the turmoil that had swallowed his youth. But freedom did not erase the ghosts of the past. Years pressed heavily on him, with memories replaying like relentless shadows. The horrors of war, the faces of fallen comrades, the icy grip of Siberian winters, the brutality of forced marches, and the confusion of fighting under 3 enemy flags haunted his nights. Yang rarely spoke about his experience. The complexity and trauma were difficult to share, compounded by language barriers and the indifference of a world eager to move on. His story, unique yet tragic, remained largely untold. Locally, he was known as a quiet, hard-working man who raised a family and sought a simple life. But those close to him sometimes glimpsed the cost war had wrought, moments of silence deep and heavy, flashes of pain when something triggered a buried memory. Psychologically, Yang struggled with symptoms today recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Nightmares, vivid memories, anxiety, and a profound sense of isolation were constant companions. Hallucinations plagued him, including visions of soldiers long gone and battle scenes that returned without warning. Despite his inner turmoil, Yang showed resilience. He worked steadily, built a home, and raised children, channeling his strength into survival. Yet the disconnect between his external calm and internal struggle defined much of his later life. The stigma of mental trauma and lack of adequate support for veterans like him meant Yang largely bore his burden alone. His experience underscores a forgotten chapter in the aftermath of the war, the hidden cost for those who survived but never returned whole. Today, Yang Kyoungjong's life serves as a profound reminder. War's lasting wounds are not only those seen on the battlefield, but are etched deeply into the hearts and minds of those who live to tell their stories. After years of being a soldier under foreign flags, a prisoner of war in multiple countries, and a survivor of unimaginable hardship, Yang Kyoungjong finally found a semblance of peace, but it came only after the guns fell silent. Released from captivity by the United States Army at the end of World War II, he chose to remain in America rather than return to a homeland burdened by occupation and war. Settling in Illinois, Yang embarked on a quiet life far removed from the battlefields and prison camps that had marked his youth. He became a U.S. citizen, married, and raised a family. Work was humble but steady, a contrast to the chaos he had endured. His long journey, from Korean farm boy to conscript in the Japanese Imperial Army, then forced service in the Soviet Red Army, soldier in the German Wehrmacht, prisoner of Allied forces, and finally a U.S. citizen, embodied one of the most extraordinary personal histories of the war. Yang rarely spoke of the horrors he had witnessed or the decades of relentless war that shaped him. His silence was a common trait among veterans carrying trauma deep within. Those closest to him noticed the unseen scars, occasional nightmares, sudden flashes of distress, and an intense desire for peace that was never fully realized. His story did not become widely known during his lifetime. It was only years after his death in Illinois on April 7, 1992, that Yang's unique journey gained recognition through historians and documentaries, painting a portrait of a man caught in the merciless tides of global conflict. The true identity of Yang Kyoungjong remains partly shrouded in mystery, as does much of his personal life. However, his legacy endures as a symbol of the resilience and tragedy faced by millions who fought not out of choice, but out of compulsion and survival instinct. His life reminds us that history is not only shaped by generals and nations, but also by individuals whose stories cross borders and battle lines, men like Yang, who, despite the chaos, persevered and lived to tell a story few can believe but none can ignore. After enduring the unimaginable, Yang Kyoungjong survived World War II. A man who had fought unwillingly for 3 different armies, survived captivity and brutal prisoner of war camps, and witnessed the greatest conflict the world had ever known. But his story did not end on the battlefield. Following the liberation of Allied POW camps in Britain, Yang was released in 1945. Unlike many of his fellow Osttruppen soldiers, he was not forcibly repatriated to the Soviet Union, a fate that often meant torture or death. Instead, he chose a new path, immigrating to the United States in 1947, settling near Chicago, Illinois. In the quiet suburbs far from war's chaos, Yang sought to build a life defined not by conflict but by family and peace. He married and raised children, worked persistently, and lived modestly. Though forever marked by his past, he strove to shelter his new family from the horrors he had endured. His death came on April 7, 1992, in Illinois, closing the final chapter on a life uniquely shaped by the relentless tides of history. Yang Kyoungjong's story remained relatively unknown outside close circles for decades, his narrative overshadowed by the grand scope of world events. Yet his extraordinary journey, from forced conscript under the Japanese Empire to Soviet POW, then soldier in the Red Army, captured and pressed into service in the German Wehrmacht, and finally an Allied POW seeking refuge in America, is one of the most remarkable individual histories of World War II. His legacy raises profound questions about identity, loyalty, and survival amid the brutal realities of war. Yang was a man without a true homeland, a soldier without choice, yet through sheer resilience he endured. His life inspired the 2011 South Korean film My Way, dramatizing this epic tale of endurance and loss. Military historians, including Anthony Beaver, cite him as a striking example of ordinary individuals caught helplessly in the vast machinery of war. Yang Kyoungjong's story remains a haunting reminder of humanity amid the horrors and complexities of global conflict. A man lost between nations, yet surviving through unyielding will.